There are genuine problems, but to act like the problem is that we don't have a professional enough military, we have the greatest military in the world, is a part of the theater of the whole thing.
Hello, listeners. Welcome to our Friday Roundtable. Joining me today are editor-at-large and columnist Russell Moore. Hey, Russell.
Hello.
And senior contributor Mike Cosper. Hi, Mike.
Hey, good to be here.
On Tuesday, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and President Trump met with top generals in the military to outline adjustments in keeping with the Trump administration's desire to shift the department from what has been called the Department of Woke to a Department of War. Mr. Hegseth introduced a 10-point policy that would go into effect immediately, including a host of changes like a revised fitness standard and what Mr. Hegseth referred to as a warrior ethos. Mike, peace through strength has been the theme since Mr. Hegseth was appointed as secretary. Where does this idea come from, and what do you take that to mean within this administration?
The best way to answer that question is actually just to point to Hegseth's own work, his writing. Hegseth published a book, I think it was called The War on Warriors, if I'm remembering correctly, and it was basically a critique of, our whole sort of the whole cadre of military institutions and how much they had, according to Hegseth, how much they had been sort of catering to the left, incorporating woke ideology in various ways, everything from, the inclusion of transgender persons, the lowering of certain fitness standards and things like that, and one of Hegseth's big issues was that he came in. He came into the department, but for a long time before he came into the department, he had been lobbying against the prosecution of a number of American soldiers who were accused of war crimes. What Hegseth essentially wanted to say with his whole sort of overall argument is we call these men and women, but particularly he's speaking to men, we call these men to go and fight, and we put them in these difficult situations, and we ought to be empowering them, encouraging them, and we ought to be focused on the things that make them effective in the field of battle, rather than on things that are, sort of pet political issues for the progressive left.
As I listened to his speech, Russell, I wondered how these words would fall on a room full of generals, being told that their warrior ethos had been lost over time.
Well, that actually was the most encouraging thing to me about watching the entire thing, because you had a silliness, a lack of maturity coming from the Secretary of Defense, even just in the way a lot of this was presented. The president's speech, but what you had from the generals was what reminded me of what Paul talks about in 1 Timothy 3 that I think we often kind of forget about or overlook, when he says that those who are in ministry called to pastor over the church are to be grave. And I think we misunderstand what grave means, to think that means irritable or dour, but it means a certain kind of gravity, a certain kind of maturity, and a responsibility to the bigger picture than just oneself. And that's what we have seen in the American military tradition, especially with generals and admirals. And I think that's one of the things that's very different about the United States than other places. You can look at South American generals taking over as dictators of their country, a very different ethos than the way that these generals and admirals have been trained. And one of the things, as many people have noted, it's not just that you had generals who were polite and subordinate in all of the right ways, but they weren't a political rally there. That's something every American ought to be glad about, regardless of where one falls on the political spectrum.
And I think one of the important things to point out in this as well is when you actually look at who is in that room, these are not desk jockeys.
No.
Right?
No.
These are not people who have been career bureaucrats. These are battle-hardened and tested. Yeah. Literally, you want to talk warrior ethos? All of them are warriors. They've served in Iraq, they've served in Afghanistan, they've served in other conflicts around the globe for years and years. So there, Hegseth is on stage talking about the loss of this ethos, and I don't like seeing fat people walking around the Pentagon, and this kind of thing. And these are people who have put their life on the line for our country, throughout their careers. I mean, one of the concerns about this meeting was the fact that there are a lot of nations around the world who would have loved nothing more than to blow up that building when however many hundred of them showed up there. Not just because they don't like Trump or they don't like the United States or whatever, but because these are people who have made bad guys suffer for the last 2-3 decades. I think part of the reason you saw such a cold reaction from the audience to Hegseth was not just sort of them embracing the dignity of the role that they're supposed to serve, but also the general insult of a lot of the comments to these men and women who have been, so deeply invested in our nation's security for such a long time.
And one of the key aspects of that being moral authority. I mean, there's one of the reasons. This is one of the reasons why generals have had such a power in American life. And when there's been a deviation from that, there's such disappointment and even a sense of betrayal. The attitude that, well, these people will just commit war crimes if we tell them to. Is completely foreign, not only to how they think, but the fact that they won't think that way is the very reason that they've been able to be so effective.
Well, let's use that lens of gravity, if we can, to talk about some of the specific things that Secretary Hegseth brought up in this speech. He talked about identity politics and wanting to rid the military of DEI, LGBTQ, race and gender quotas. All of these things, he said, had to go. In fact, he called them debris. How would we understand words like this when he's talking about lethality as the calling card for the military within this framework of gravity? Is this something that Mr. Hegseth is right needs to go?
So I think what would be interesting to clarify, and I haven't seen reporting on this, and I'm genuinely, I say this truthfully, like I'm genuinely interested in the reporting on this. How much of that is a reality in our policy? Because essentially what he's arguing is the military of all places, because it needs to be lethal, because it needs to be super effective, this should be, the purest meritocracy on the planet, right? You should be in the role that you're in because you're competent and you're fit, to serve in whatever that role is, whether you're a Washington bureaucrat or a Navy SEAL that's putting yourself in harm's way on a regular basis. From what I have seen, and from what I am familiar with, is that there's not a lot of, for instance, combat positions in the military where the standards have been dramatically lowered for the sake of inclusion, DEI, whatever the case may be. Now, there are certainly roles inside the military where some of those standards have shifted or lowered or changed or whatever, because the emphasis is not on combat readiness. The emphasis is on somebody's ability. I mean, you're talking about the largest bureaucracy in the world is the U.S. military, and there are skills necessary for running the largest bureaucracy in the world that have nothing to do with the how many pull-ups you can do. And how good you are with an MP5, machine gun. So all that to say, part of what struck me about it was it felt like a sort of performative, we're against woke. It lacked a lot of specificity, and we have not seen a lot of policy stuff that sounds like they're making big changes to the way the institutions actually run. I think what you do see, and I think this is what's animating for Hegseth in particular, what you do see is you have seen a lot of, I mean, there are a number of roles in the Department of Defense that are, they're essentially political appointments, right? Because the Secretary of Defense is the one who's going to put people into these various positions, or the president's going to weigh in, or whatever. And you have seen Hegseth go in and clear out a number of those more or less political appointments of these sort of older, sort of statesman-like roles in various bureaucratic positions or whatever, that were clearly left of center, and individuals who had made comments that sounded more progressive. I just don't. I am yet to be convinced that there's a lack of a warrior ethos in the U.S. military at the level where we want the warrior ethos, right? At the level where we want combat ready, strong, fearless, and capable soldiers. So I'm interested. I'm really interested in this story as it goes along. I'm very interested to see if they actually do implement major policy changes. It felt far more, sound and fury than anything real based on what we've seen so far.
Russell, the measuring rod for quality now seems to be 1990. Mr. Hegseth said if we weren't doing it in 1990, we shouldn't be doing it now, save for adjustments in technology. Why do you think he would reference 1990 as that pivot point?
Well, I mean, one of the things that he's talking about are the standards when it comes to sexual harassment and sexual violence, talking about we're not going to have people walking around on eggshells anymore, when what we have actually seen is that throughout, 1990s, particularly in early 2000s, horrific sexual assault and sexual violence upon women who are in the military who had no way of actually adjudicating and dealing with what was happening to them. I mean, that's very well documented. And to dismiss this as though what was happening there is a kind of political correctness speech police, particularly from somebody with Mr. Hegseth's alleged background, really is I think dissonant with where we should be going.
Just to expand on that, I think this is actually really important. It was September 1991 that the tailhook scandal took place, and this was a scandal. There was a military association convention in Las Vegas, and a number of sexual assaults took place in the midst of this, and it was not the first time something like this had happened, but it was the first time something like this became front page news. And you had a number of news organizations that really sort of committed themselves to telling these stories, sort of forcing the public to reckon with it, forcing politicians to reckon with it. Go look at that scandal. That was 1991, right? So we're going back to 1990, we're going back to pre-tailhook days. That's not insignificant at all.
How does this relate to his decision to allow those who had, quote, made an honest mistake to continue their careers and allow the military to be rid of a zero defect culture? Is that what he's referring to there when he talks about this, the zero defect culture? Well,
look, again, this is a guy who has, I think it goes beyond that specific issue, because again, this is a guy who, part of his platform prior to becoming Secretary of Defense was lobbying on behalf of soldiers accused of war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't know what exactly it means. I think there are questions about policy that we need to answered. What is that? What exactly does that mean? What's going to be wiped from people's records, or what's not going to go on to a record? What is actually changing here? Again, so much of this has just been gesture and performative. I'm interested to see what the policies are. I'm also interested in if they actually start trying to implement policies that exonerate people who have sexually harassed fellow soldiers or committed war crimes or, in some other way sort of breached their responsibilities or their oath, what's going to happen? Like, if those efforts begin, what's going to happen with the leadership around them? I think the honor code inside the U.S. military is very intense, like the sort of natural honor code. Russell was talking about this kind of a few minutes ago. I think it's intense enough that there's a lot of people that aren't going to kind of embrace this lying down.
Well, I guess we're going to get to test that, because part of what happened was the president saying to them, I'm asking you to violate not only your vows, but the entire American concept of a military by telling you that you're at war with Americans and with American cities. Right. I mean, we're not going to have very long to find out whether or not we have a military or something akin to a militia in a third world country. And my guess is it's going to be the first. Mm-hmm. I think the training is just really strong and deep for that very reason we were talking about earlier, because it's not just about how do you effectively kill people. That's clearly there. But it's also about what kind of a person must somebody be who is called upon to make these kinds of decisions. I don't think that's very quickly or easily undone.
When you talk about the kind of person who is needed, I think of how Mr. Hegseth presented his ideas as the military version of the Golden Rule. It's an interesting rhetorical move there. Talk to me a little bit about this application of Jesus' words.
Look, I think that the idea that the implication is that our military leadership is not being discerning and thoughtful and compassionate and loving to their soldiers. And I see no evidence that that's true in any way. Talk to military leadership. Talk to people who have served. Talk to people who were, sort of low-level grunts in the military, and listen to the way they talk about their superior officers. There's a great book by a former Navy SEAL, a guy named Jocko Willink. So Jocko is a decorated warrior. I mean, this guy's an amazing example of a patriot. Led, essentially led SEAL Team, I think it was SEAL Team 3 in the Battle of Ramadi. Saw unbelievable stuff in combat, and the book is an incredible book. And one of the things that he talks about is he said the lowest form of leadership on earth is I am your superior, therefore you have to do what I say, right? And the military understands this. The military understands that if you actually want soldiers whom you can point to and say, hey, go run into that barrage of bullets that's coming in our direction, they're not going to do it effectively merely because of the fact that you are their superior and there's a flow chart that shows that they have to do what you tell them. Real leadership is you develop these relationships of trust and accountability, and there's a real sense, from the troops that their superiors love them and are invested in them and are not going to ask them to do something that doesn't matter, that isn't important. And Jocko talks about this. He's like, that's deeply embedded in the military culture. You don't get promoted just because you've been around long enough or whatever. You get promoted because your superior officers look at you and they say, this is the kind of person that can lead men and women into combat, that can command respect and build that trust and everything else. So I think that, again, I just think there's a level of insult to a lot of Hegseth's comments that just ignore the reality that, this is how the military works. If the military doesn't work this way, it just doesn't work. I mean, that's when you get soldiers, abandoning their posts and committing mutinies and working to undermine their superior officers when they are convinced that they're incompetent or lack any kind of affect for the good of their soldiers. Go watch Band of Brothers, like Captain Sobel. Like, there's a reason they all hated Sobel, and there's a reason they had to get rid of Sobel. Was he commanded no respect? No one ever believed that he loved them or was invested in them in any significant way. But for Dick Winters, those guys would have done anything for Dick Winters.
And if we want to see an illustration of that, take out your wallet and pull out a $1 bill, because from the very beginning, that's the ethos of the country and of its military is General Washington. Yeah. That picture isn't there because he was president. He was president because of what caused him to be so both loved by his people and feared, and carrying a kind of authority and gravity and weight about him that is distinctively American all the way down.
I think it's really interesting that you mentioned those two symbols, both Band of Brothers, war movies, and also the $1 bill, because there were so many allusions to Hollywood in both of these speeches. Trump referring to loving watching Victory at Sea, describing the generals as straight out of central casting. Even the backdrop of the big American flag, one writer said it made Pete Hegseth look like he was on the set of Patton during this speech. And it makes me think that perhaps there is this deep longing for the kind of relationship and belonging that we see in the military, that kind of faithfulness and commitment to duty and honor that the administration is really trying to find in ways that are less than healthy, or in ways that really don't need to be done because they're already there. President Trump said later in his speech to the generals that we were a dead country, but now we're the hottest country in the world, and that people used to not want to join the military. What do you think it would take to reinvigorate this passion for service to one's country in the ways that I think these symbols call forth? I think
it already does. I mean, it kind of comes back to what Mike was saying a few moments ago. I remember being invited one time to speak at an event, and people who are from a different denomination than I am, and they kept sending these things. Now, don't make any jokes about our denomination or insult our denomination. And I'm thinking, I mean, do you really think that I'm just going to come there to insult? I mean, if you think that, then why are you even inviting me? The fact that you have to say it, to act as though there's a problem here. There are genuine problems, but to act like the problem is that we don't have a professional enough military. We have the greatest military in the world. Is a part of the theater of the whole thing, and it's intended to be the theater of the whole thing. And I think that the only message that I can see that was really intended to be given to the generals and admirals was summed up when the president said, I really would like you to applaud. If you don't want to applaud, you can leave, and if you leave, you won't be promoted. Ha ha. That probably was the only message really that was sent to them. Everything else was done to send a message to the rest of the country, and summed up in that being, we're going to train for war in our cities, which those guys in that room know illegal, unconstitutional, and they responded appropriately to that, at least so far.
Yeah. Look, I think one of the things to point to that helps to push back on some of that is what just happened with the U.S. military bombing Iran's nuclear facilities. Go read the details of that operation. It's extraordinary. The time, like the precision of it, the fact that they were able to hit these multiple facilities at the same time. They were, even to the second when each of these massive bombs hit these facilities, so that the maximum level of destruction possible was carried out. There were 135 aircraft in the air supporting that mission. There were multiple branches of the military involved, multiple departments. You think about putting 135 planes in the air, just that, like how much how much bureaucracy, how much coordination, how much, how many logistics had to be managed to pull something like that off. They did not come up with that plan the day before, right? Like, this is something that they have been planning. I guarantee they've been planning, in the direction of something like this for at least 20, 25 years. So you have a military that's capable of some of the most extraordinary things imaginable, and a military that is profoundly feared. You talk about the war in Ukraine. The last thing in the world that Putin wants is for U.S. soldiers to get involved in the conflict with Ukraine. The last thing in the world that Hamas wants in Gaza right now would be to provoke Americans for them to start sending in, American special operators to try to finish that war off. There's a capacity that we have that is unmatched, and that didn't start in January. I will say, I do think that, to be fair to Hegseth, right, there is data, there's survey data, and there's recruitment data that shows, number one, for the first time in years, the military branches are meeting their recruitment targets, and they're meeting them early. That's new, right? Like, so I think there's something about sort of the bravado of Hegseth, his ability, I think, particularly to kind of speak to young men, the fact that he shows up at these various, events that he does, and he works out with the troops, he does PT with them and all the rest. Like, there is something to, like, the ethos that has been attractive, and there's also data that shows that military morale is up from where it was a year ago. But nonetheless, I think I would imagine that what you're seeing right now is, like, morale is up with, like, the younger troops, younger soldiers who are, motivated and moved by some of this bravado. But then, as we saw the other day, these career guys who've been doing this for decades are sitting there going, what are you even talking about? With a lot of the more sort of dramatic language.
Well, as we close this segment today, we want to give a big thank you to our American servicemen and women who work on our behalf so selflessly. We here at the Bulletin are grateful for your service. Listeners, we know you don't always have 2.5 hours to listen to political speeches, but we do appreciate your commitment to engaging the news from a Christian perspective with us. Join us over at Substack every week for our Wednesday News Digest that gives you bite-sized news content that will keep you up to date on the headlines and offer opportunities to dig deeper into how the news relates to your faith. Listen to the full episode wherever podcasts are found.